I mean, I'm going to talk to this guy. I mean, you almost don't want to make what for sure. Even if he hears it.
What was yesterday? Orange? No, yesterday there wasn't. There wasn't. Here we go. Pretty much a mess. Thank you. Don't fall.
Quickly. Good afternoon. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the budget overall, a little bit more about the state senate and those who are ready to work and those who are ready to not, and then a little bit about our timelines. First off, I want to talk very specifically about the fact that what we're proposing in this budget adjustment bill is really about our commitment to the future. And if we fail to make that commitment, we're ultimately going to have to deal with the consequences, not only ourselves, but the consequences we'll pass on to our children and their children into the future. And so this is an incredibly important moment in our state's history. For us, it's about a combination of things. Certainly, it's about balancing the budget for the remainder of fiscal year 2011, which faces a shortfall. Although the budget reforms that we include in terms of wage and benefit are only a small portion of that. I'm going to touch on that in just a moment. On top of that, it's probably of even greater importance that we pass the budget repair bill more than just for this fiscal year, but because it sets the table for ensuring that we're able to balance the $3.6 billion budget deficit we face going into the next biennium. And third, it's important that we do that because on top of that, we need to make sure that as part of doing that, we give our local governments the tools they need to balance their budget in light of the fact that there's going to be less state aid. Like nearly every other state across the country that's facing a deficit, we're going to be looking at reductions in state aid to local governments. But unlike those other states that are cutting funds for schools, for the university systems, for other local governments, we're ultimately pushing forward with this plan to make sure that those local governments have the tools to accommodate for those reductions in state aid without hurting their core services. A couple things I want to touch on as part of that. First off, I want to make it clear, I've said this all along, but I want to repeat this because it's worth noting. I have great respect for the more than 300,000 state and local government employees who work here in the state of Wisconsin. They're good, decent, hardworking people. They're professionals, the vast majority of whom for the past week and a half have come to work each and every day, done the job they're paid to do, and continue to be professional public servants, and I thank them for that. And I know the vast majority of them are going to continue to do that. I've also acknowledged along the way that you can hear them out there. There are protesters here each and every day, and they have every right to be heard, at least those from Wisconsin. I know increasingly there are more and more from outside of the state, but for those from Wisconsin, they have every right to be heard. But I also want to make it clear, particularly to those union leaders coming in from outside of the state of Wisconsin, that when given the choice to stand with them or to stand with the millions of hardworking taxpayers all across Wisconsin, many of whom are paying much more for health care and retirement benefits than the modest amount we're asking for in this proposal, I'm going to stand with the hardworking taxpayers of Wisconsin. That's what this debate is all about. A couple things have come up over the weekend I want to address. One was, interestingly enough, over the weekend, a couple of the statewide union leaders suggested that the 5 and 7% we're asking for pension and health care benefits might be acceptable. That's an interesting development because, of course, a week ago, they were saying that that was unacceptable because their members couldn't afford to pay for that. It's equally as interesting because some of those same leaders tried to cram through last December a series of state contracts before we got in office, but after the elections. So it's interesting to see how their logic changes day by day depending on what the moment is. The reality is that that's not acceptable for us because this is about balancing our budget not only today, but balancing our budgets at both the state and the local government for years to come. If you don't make the changes we're proposing for collective bargaining in this budget repair bill, you make it very difficult for local governments in particular to balance their budget in the next biennium and in the years to come. And I'll give you one good example. There's many of them out there. I know because I used to be a county official and I saw it day in and day out, but I'll give you a good example of their schools. Many of our schools here in the state of Wisconsin are, because of collective bargaining and the contracts that come from that, required to buy their insurance for health care through the WA Trust. That's the state the state teachers union healthcare system, healthcare plan. The WA Trust is the mark that they are required to hit as part of their contracts. Well, ultimately, if we were to change that by removing that collective bargaining requirement because of the changes we're proposing in our budget repair bill, we believe the approximate amount of savings would be $68 million for school districts all across the state of Wisconsin that don't currently have that option of not buying in the WA Trust. That's real money. That's money that goes beyond the savings with the health care contribution and the pension contribution. That's one of the many examples of why it's so critically important to change collective bargaining and limit it so that it's down to the base pay here in the state of Wisconsin, not just for the state government, but for local governments as well. Another item that came up over the weekend was the idea of a sunset provision on this that would expire after the next election. Again, that's another non-starter, and the reason for that's simple. The reason we face the trouble we face today, the reason Wisconsin has a $3.6 billion budget deficit is certainly in part because of the economy like it is for states all across Wisconsin. But I would contend one of the biggest reasons is because the previous governors and previous legislatures, particularly in this last two-year cycle, made one-time fixes to push the budget problems into the future. 2 years ago, Governor Jim Doyle, my predecessor, and many of those same state Senate Democrats, in fact 12 of the 14 Senate Democrats who are hiding out in another state failing to do their job, voted for a state budget that included $2.2 billion in one-time federal stimulus aid. Money that we were all told at the time was going to go for things like infrastructure, roads, and bridges, but instead they used it to plug their Medicaid and school aid budget deficit. That just pushed the problem off to the future. And now with the economy continuing not to improve here and across the country, that's forced us into a $3.6 billion hole. For us to do the same thing again and just push the problem off to the future is unacceptable. The time has come up. Our bills are due. It's time for us to move forward and tell the truth to the people of this state and people all across the country who are listening, that we're going to do the right thing. We're going to balance the budget the right way. We're not going to push it off to the next generation of taxpayers. Second thing is on the state Senate. Again, I want to applaud Senate Majority Leader Scott Fitzgerald and the Senate leadership for deciding that the best thing for them to do is to do what the people of Wisconsin elected them to do, and that's to show up for work and to get the job done. So they're going to be back in in session tomorrow. I applaud them for that. I think it's clear, and once again, I'm going to ask, because I'm assuming they're listening right now, for those 14 Senate Democrats, you've had your time. Now it's time to come home. You asked last week for time for the public to understand what's in the bill. The Joint Finance Committee had 17 and a half hours of testimony. I once served in the state legislature. I don't ever recall that amount of time on any given bill out there in the past. This is unprecedented in terms of the amount of attention. I don't think you could find a single person, at least in the state of Wisconsin, who couldn't tell you they're aware of what's going on with this bill and what the debate's all about. The time is up. It's time for them to come back and participate in democracy. If you want to participate in democracy, you got to be in the arena, and the arena is right here in Madison, Wisconsin. It's not in Chicago. It's not in Rockford. It's not anywhere else. It's in our state's capital, and that's where they belong. And I want to just add further on that. This is something that they were well aware of. I briefed Senator Miller and Representative Barca the morning of the announcement before I came out here and announced it to the public and before I introduced the bill at 10:30 a week and a half ago. Let me repeat that. Senator Miller and Representative Barca were briefed by me personally, and I gave them an outline of what is in the budget repair bill in full writing before I sent it over to them in the press. Ironically, on the flip side of that, I only learned about the Senate Democrats going to another state by all of you in the meeting. We have been very transparent in this discussion. We've been very forthright in what our objectives are, and we've been very informative in terms of what we've told the Senate and Assembly minorities, and I would respect the same courtesy for them to come back home. They want to talk to us, come to the state Senate, make your case, make your argument, but do what the people of the state of Wisconsin ultimately elected you to do. And finally, in terms of a deadline or a timeline, if you will, and again, this is important for Senate Democrats to be mindful of. As I pointed out when we first introduced this about a week and a half ago, the $30 million that's included in this budget repair bill is just one piece of the much larger puzzle of balancing this budget, and the $300 million in the next biennium's worth of savings for state government employees is just one piece of it as well. But that $30 million, if we don't get it by starting our health care and pension contributions by April 1st, translates in this budget, which ends June 30th, to the equivalent of 1,500 state government employees being laid off. Now, as I've said before, I don't want to lay anybody off. The equivalent at the state level for the next budget would be 5,000 to 6,000 state government employees being laid off and 5,000 to 6,000 local government employees. That's teachers and city workers and county workers and others out there. In this economy, even though our unemployment rate is better than the national average, it's still 7.5%. That's unacceptable to me. I was elected to get more people working, and that's what we've been doing this first month and a half in office. So I don't want to see anybody laid off. But if the Senate Democrats don't come back and at least allow us to debate this bill and give us the ability to pass this bill, the alternative is just for that $30 million alone, we'd have the equivalent of 1,500 layoffs. On top of that, this measure also includes savings from debt restructuring that generates $165 million worth of savings for the state. If we don't pass that by this weekend, we fail to be able to achieve those savings, and in turn that opens the door for potentially even a larger number of layoffs of state government workers and the potential for other areas of state government to be affected by that. Again, that's unacceptable. That is an option that we can avoid if the state Senate is able to convene, and it's yet one more reason why Senate Democrats need to come back home. The other quick things on that is we also have a challenge, less time sensitive, but it will be forthcoming. We have a deficit from the budget that was passed 2 years ago by my predecessor and the previous majorities that also has a hole in it when it comes to Medicaid. The dollars available to pay for Medicaid reimbursement run out approximately in the beginning of April. We, by statute, have to act through the legislature to move funds in to shift that. So a failure to act also creates a hole in the Medicaid fund and opens up the potential of Medicaid providers who are billed through Medicaid not being able to get reimbursed immediately for their payments. So there's all sorts of challenges. All these things can be resolved ultimately if the state Senate Democrats, the 14 members of the state Senate who are hiding out in another state, opt to do what their constituents elect them to do, and that's to show up here in the Capitol and vote on this measure. With that, I can entertain a couple questions before I got to run.
I have a question. A lot of people out there are saying that, here's the thing, that they feel that it's a bit of a tit for tat. Well, the unions tried to push something through when Joel was here, now you guys are pushing something through. They're saying they will agree on the cuts, but they feel that the request to eliminate collective bargaining, basically amounts to union busting. So the question is,
Well, for us, we're broke. We don't have any more money. We have a $3.6 billion budget deficit, and you really can't negotiate when you don't have money to negotiate on. For us to be involved in good faith negotiations, we'd have to offer something. We don't have anything to offer because we don't have any money. We're like nearly every other state across the country. What I'm trying to do with this measure is unlike what Governor Cuomo's done in New York, unlike what Governor Brown's doing in California and other places across the country, where they're ultimately seeking to balance their budget by cutting billions of dollars for their schools, their university system, their local governments, and not giving them the tools they need to balance that. We're giving these local governments the tools they need to balance the budget without having to have massive layoffs, without having to cut services off there. And one thing I'll correct, it's not a tit for tat. The simple matter is I campaigned on this all throughout the election. Anybody who says they're shocked on this has been asleep for the past 2 years. I talked about this. I talked about the 5 and 7%. Heck, for the past 8 years prior to me being governor, I pushed for this in Milwaukee County because I knew it was a much better alternative to have changes in pension and health care contributions than to lay off hundreds at the local level, in my case now thousands at the state level. And for us, it's about balancing the budget. If we were about doing something to the unions beyond balancing the budget, we would have completely eliminated collective bargaining. In this budget, in this budget repair bill, it is maintained for the base salary. And if we were ultimately about attacking the unions, we'd be doing something to private unions. I don't have any interest in doing anything to private unions. I think the private unions are a key part to getting the state's economy going. I welcome working with them. This bill and our measure has nothing to do with private unions here in the state of Wisconsin.
When it comes to Medicaid, why take the public out of the decision-making process for the coverage there?
For us, it's still very much involved. The Joint Finance Committee would still have to have passed a review, and most importantly, for any requests for any sort of adjustments to try and account for the fact that Medicaid, like it is everywhere across the country, is one of the biggest growing parts of state budget deficits. Ours, out of our 3.6, about $1.8 billion is the Medicaid deficit. We need to have more flexibility, and we need to have the ability to make an appeal to the federal government. But the Joint Finance Committee or Budget Writing Committee would ultimately have to still approve that, and probably of greater importance, the Obama administration would have to approve any of the changes we're proposing.
Are you surprised by the reaction out in the hall?
No. I mean, anytime you're going to make a bold move challenging the status quo, you're going to face passion out there. But anytime you're facing it, I did it for 8 years. I was the first Republican elected in Milwaukee County. I was reelected 2 times thereafter, largely because we made bold moves to get that pension system fixed, to balance the budget without raising taxes, and to put more power back in the hands of the taxpayers of the county that I represent at that time. That's the same thing I ran on all throughout this campaign, and it's the same mission I have here, is to make sure we can do 2 things. One, in our first month to 5 weeks in office, we were the fastest moving state in the country to show that we could make changes to make it easier to do business in the state, to allow the private sector to put more people to work, and ultimately to achieve our goal of creating 250,000 jobs in the private sector by building a better business climate. Secondly, we've got to balance the budget. And anybody who doubts that's interconnected need only look at what Illinois did a month ago. In Illinois, because they failed to make the tough decisions, they have a pension system that's only about half funded. They failed to make the tough decisions, and so instead of doing those tough things, they turned to the taxpayers, they raised taxes on businesses and individuals, and in turn we've seen a massive exodus of employers and jobs and individuals looking to come to places like the state of Wisconsin because they realize it is a better business climate and a better place to create jobs and put people to work in. We've got to have that same stability if we want to get people working again here in the state of Wisconsin, and that's exactly what we're going to do. For too many years, too many politicians in this state, and right frankly across this country, have ignored the reality that many of our governments are broke, and the best way to fix them is to take head-on the challenges we face here in the state of Wisconsin, and certainly other states should do it the national or across the country as well.
It's all about saving money. Why do you exempt firefighters and police officers?
Yeah, real simple. For us, the one thing that I think nearly universal expectation of government is public safety protection. We saw last week, for I think it was 3 days, teachers here in the city of Madison walked off the job, and which is really ultimately what they're striking illegal action. Thank God cooler heads prevailed, and they decided to come back to work today, and I appreciate that, or at least in many jurisdictions across the state. But we can by no means ever have a gap when it comes to public safety. I can't have the possibility, and I don't think most people are going to walk off, but I can't have the possibility anywhere here in the state of Wisconsin that if there was a fire or a crime or anything else, that there would be one gap, one interruption in services out there because there's no way we're going to put the public safety at risk.
We got time for one more question.
Sure.
On Friday, your office called the Assembly Speaker and said that his safety could not be assured into the evening. If there was a legitimate concern about safety, and why weren't the Democrats also made aware of that concern?
Well, we're going to be in the process in the coming days as the debate continues to make sure that all 132, and I hope that includes the 14 state senators who are missing in action, but all 132 members of the State Assembly and the State Senate have adequate protections, because we know there's a lot of passion out there. There's a lot of passions we saw this weekend on either side of the issue. Part of living in a democracy is being responsive to the people, but it should mean putting your own personal safety at risk. We want to make sure that every one of our members, Republican and Democrat alike, who serve in these chambers, have adequate protection. I think the vast, vast majority of people who are here in the state, including the many thousands who come in from other states, as we saw over this weekend, have been overwhelmingly positive in terms of following the law, being respectful of others. I would hope and pray that that continues here, but we're not going to take any risk. We're going to make sure that all 132, no matter how much pressure they get the kind of safety and the security that they need to feel safe, not only here but in their homes, and that's important for us. Thanks very much for your time.
Any reaction to the reports that Dr. Buchanan passed?